Welcome back. Uh, we're going to cover the fall of Napoleon and European reaction. And this is a pretty substantial fall. It comes in phases. Um, you can't just kill the guy. You can't just beat him. You got to really beat him. Muhammad Ali once said that. If you want to be the champ, you just can't kind of beat me. You have to really beat me. And that's probably a very true statement for Napoleon. So let's talk about why this even matters. So it matters because after the turmoil of the French Revolutionary years and the eventual fall of Napoleon, European rulers wanted to return to a conservative order, keeping a balance of power among nations. Liberals and nationalists, however, struggled to achieve more liberal governments and new nations. And we're going to see this sort of play out. There's going to be a reshaping and a restructuring of European society as they mostly return to the old order, the old regime. Absolute monarchs, once again, taking the thrones in their respective countries. But they're going to have to contend with these new concepts of liberalism, older concepts like conservatism, and of course nationalism as well as concepts like republicanism that begin to sweep in a larger degree throughout Europe after Napoleon's downfall. So let's talk about Napoleon. How does he lose the empire? Well, it began in 1812. He is going to decide to invade Russia. So Russia, outside of Russian territories, not a very effective military. And this is kind of historically true. Outside of Russia, the Russian military system is old, it's backwards, it's quite weak despite having a gigantic population. And this is going to be proven true time and time again throughout history. Even as we go forward into World War I and even World War II. It won't be near the tail end of World War II that Russia kind of sees a massive about face and a resurgence in their militaristic capabilities. So basically what happens is Russia is like a pseudo-allied state, right? They're all but beaten, they're defeated, but that's outside their borders. So when Napoleon wants to ultimately, hurt England by the continental system, and if you recall from last session, this is all about, choking economically England into starvation, into weakness. They're trying to prevent English goods from being traded throughout Europe. And of course, vice versa. They don't want any of these other European nations to trade with England. So Russia clearly doesn't want to do this. There's value in fine English manufactured goods that Russia just simply doesn't have, so they want access to it. So they refuse to remain in the continental system. So this leaves Napoleon with little choice but to invade. And this is going to be really the beginning of the end for Napoleon. So we're going to watch this video.
The Italian resort island of Elba has a quiet charm all its own. You can climb the hills, skip rocks, or just take in the view. No wonder thousands of families vacation here. One visitor whose stay is memorialized everywhere? Napoleon Bonaparte. But the French emperor wasn't here on holiday. He was exiled to Elba after his defeat at the Battle of Paris in 1814. The terms of his surrender? Napoleon would be under a kind of house arrest, but undisputed master of the house. Here, but only here on Elba, he would remain emperor. He even designed a new flag for his tiny little island empire. At its center, 3 Bs, the emblem Napoleon preferred over the French monarchy's fleur-de-lis. Giuseppe Bartolini, director of Elba's National Center of Napoleonic Studies, says that when Napoleon arrived, the new flag was raised over the harbor's fort. During less than a year's time, Napoleon modernized the island. On Elba, he built roads and a sewer system.
Napoleone!
Elba is the kind of laid-back place where laundry is still hung out to dry, and homemade wine is offered to visitors. And under a full moon at Easter time, worshippers solemnly parade a statue of Jesus through town. Into this traditional culture, Napoleon's arrival injected a kind of worldly sophistication. From the outside, his country house may not look like the home of an emperor, but in the living room, Bartolini points out, an homage to Napoleon's Egyptian military campaign, hugely influential on European style. Napoleon lived quite comfortably here. This is his bathtub. And the two doves tugging on a ribbon, they represent Napoleon and his wife Marie-Louise, who never did join him on the island. His mistress, a Polish countess, did. Napoleon brought her and their son to a mountaintop retreat. From there, he could just make out Corsica, the island where he was born. And only a few months later, short on cash and watching the restored French monarchy lose popularity, Napoleon left Elba. His gamble to reclaim power would last just 100 days, until his defeat at Waterloo. This time his captors took no chances. He was sent to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. No sovereign there, he was simply a prisoner, far, far away from the island that still flies his flag.
So you can tell from the video, Napoleon is ultimately going to be exiled twice, but how do we even get there? How does he get to Elba and then to St. Helena in exile? Well, because of the Russian campaign. So he knew the risks. Russia's a massive country. The greatest general Russia has ever had is General Winter. So as he goes in with his grand army of more than 600,000 men in 1812 in the summer, he knows that he has to work quickly. He doesn't even have a full 6 months before winter is going to hit. So he only has a handful of months to really do the job and do it well. And of course, he's experienced the Russian military system before, so he knows how best to defeat them. He's got his, lightning quick troops. They're supplied with just as much as they need to be supplied with, so that way they can keep moving very quickly as they attack. They loot, they pillage, and they take whatever foodstuffs and material that they need. And of course, there's a supply train that will follow. This is a problem, though, because the Russians actually learn from their prior defeats and their engagements with Napoleon. So what do? They engage in a slash and burn tactic. They basically refuse to do battle. So what they're going to do as they see Napoleon's army coming is they retreat for hundreds of miles. And in their wake, they burn down their own villages, the countryside, food storehouses, granary silos, you name it. This is all to keep Napoleon's army from finding that precious food. So as time moves on, and the days tick away into months, and they have to, sort of march through the Russian tundra, they'll ultimately wind up fighting the Russians at Borodino. But it's a very costly victory. This is what we call, in military terms, a Pyrrhic victory. Basically, what that means is that although Napoleon's forces win, it's an indecisive victory. It's very skewed. Like, Napoleon's army lost about maybe 35,000 men at this battle, whereas the Russians lost about 45,000. So you could say, all right, clearly one side lost more than the other, but not so much that it was worth it. I mean, when you consider the Russian population alone, it's really not all that worth it. And the worst part of it was that even though they were only about 20, 60 miles away from Moscow, they still didn't have any food. So they have to keep fighting. So they win this indecisive victory. There's still no food. They can't really get supplies from the countryside or the other villages or cities that have been burned. And so by the time Napoleon makes his way to Moscow, the city's already ablaze. there's not going to be any great fighting here. It's mostly abandoned by late October. And this is where winter begins to hit. So you can tell from this painting, The Burning of Moscow in October of 1812, the artist, this is kind of, the art of spin that's going on here. Not sure we can quite see it, but essentially, Napoleon here on horseback, leading his troops, he's pointing into the city of Moscow. It's destroyed, it's burning. I mean, if you didn't know what was actually going on, if you didn't actually know the history, you would think, oh, this is Napoleon and his grand army conquering, the capital of Russia, Moscow. Like, this is an overwhelming victory, but it's not. This is how you spin a loss. Moscow's burning. There's no foodstuffs to be looted. And winter is here. Winter's basically here. So this is going to facilitate the Great Retreat. So thousands of soldiers now are starving. They're freezing. Of the 600,000 that came with Napoleon to Russia, fewer than 40,000 are going to survive as they try to make their way into Poland in January 1813 as they retreat from Russia. This is a military disaster. In fact, noted by Jean-Roch Cogniet, who is a veteran of the Grand Army. You can read this primary document yourself, but Jean-Roch Cogniet, he talks about the terrible retreat from Moscow in the winter of 1812, and he had fought with Napoleon Bonaparte since the year 1800 in Italy. So he saw service in all the major campaigns. So this is a 12-year veteran here who's been following Napoleon. And he doesn't accuse Napoleon, he doesn't blame him. He just simply, and this might be due to the fact that, he's a veteran soldier, so you don't blame, the command, especially from a commander who has led you so brilliantly for just about over a decade. So what he does say, though, is that the Russian winter is very severe. He says that the halting places were miserably supplied. The horses, which were so essential for travel, especially through the winter, died of hunger and cold. Many of the men do as well. What horses that are still alive, by the time they reach cottages, the horses are devouring the thatches, not leaving much for the men. I know from another account, from the diary of a Napoleonic foot soldier by Jacob Walters, a German foot soldier who joined the Grand Army, quite a young lad, thought that it'd be a grand adventure. When he gets into Russia, he finds out otherwise. He notes, just like Cogniet, that the cold is so intense, it's like 17 degrees below zero to 28 degrees below zero. If you didn't have a horse, you want to find one as quick as possible, because if you don't, that basically means your death. The horse even serves as a food supply, as men would cut open their horses' flanks and drain blood and collect them in bowls to sort of heat them up and drink them if they could make a fire, or just drink the blood straight up. Many horses and people die in their tents and their camps. The night is the worst. The roads are like glass as they ice over, slowing down travel and exposing them to cold even further. And the soldiers are just so worn out and cold and tired that when they're holding their guns, they barely have the strength to let go of them, because their guns, the barrels of their guns, are so cold that they stick to their hands. Their guns are literally freezing to their hands. And Jacob Walters, in his account, unlike Cogniet, when he finally manages to get to suitable bivouac, a suitable camp, if you will, with heat, his head, because of all the sweat from all the marching and the hardship and the frostbite, his head, he describes as looking like a dragon. It's like covered in black scales that he has to crack open because of the frostbite. And underneath that is all the lice from the horrible living conditions that they were in. Terrible, right? Awful stuff. So this is a miserable defeat for Napoleon. You can't really spin this one. I mean, you try with a painting, but those who were there, and of course, when the news follows the disaster, other European states, they're going to begin to rise up and they're going to attack the crippled French army. So this is what's going to lead an assault on Paris by a European coalition. And Paris will ultimately wind up being captured in 1814. This is what's going to facilitate the exile of Napoleon for the first time to the island of Elba. So he has been exiled off the northwest coast of Italy. The victorious European powers restore monarchy to France in the person of King Louis XVIII. And he's, of course, the brother to the executed King Louis XVI. So, Napoleon, still has a lot of support. I mean, even though he's exiled, you can kind of tell, even from this depiction of his exile to Elba, there's a few ways you might interpret this portrayal from the artist, but I think one way you can see this portrayal is that, and it's kind of obvious, that these men are still giving him his space. It was a terrible defeat, it's an overthrow, but there's still like this space, right? They give this man, they're standing in awe almost. Like they cannot stand shoulder to shoulder with him. They can't stand by him. He is a man apart, this Napoleon Bonaparte. So the new king, King Louis XVIII, has little support. He's not in power for very long. And the revolution is still very much in the minds of the people, and not really revolution as much as empire, the glory of empire, and they're not ready to surrender that. So Napoleon, he does not want to oblige in his exile. As we saw from the video, he's not going to be there but for a few months, a year at the most, but basically just a few months, and he's restless. So he is going to plan his return. So he's going to leave the island of Elba and slip back into France with of course, support. And for those troops who are answering to the summons of the kings to capture Napoleon, once he learns about Napoleon's escape from Elba and his return to France, Napoleon, in one of the most daring moves, willingly opens up his coat and addresses these soldiers. He says, quote, "Soldiers of the 5th Regiment, I am your emperor. If there is a man among you who would kill his emperor, here I am," end quote. This is a gamble. And it's a successful one. No one is going to fire a shot. Instead, they will chant, "Long live the emperor," and the troops are going to go over to his side. And the revolution, the attempt to reclaim empire, is back on. And so on March 20th, 1815, Napoleon is going to enter Paris in a grand triumph. With this news, Russia, Great Britain, Austria, and Prussia again pledged to defeat the man they called, quote, "the enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world," end quote. So Napoleon is going to raise another French army. This is going to be filled with very salty veterans who rallied from all over France, veterans who were still loyal to him, surprisingly, after the Russia campaign. And they are going to ready an attack on these sort of European allied troops stationed across the border of Belgium outside of France. This is going to begin, this isn't going to begin, but this is going to be like that middle leg of Napoleon's defeat. So the Russia campaign and its disaster and the Great Retreat leading to the exile of Elba was the first phase. This is pretty much like the middle phase before the second and ultimately final phase, if you will. So they are going to meet at Waterloo. This is the notorious historical final climactic battle of Napoleon's military career, where he is ultimately going to be defeated. Britain and Prussia have a combined army under the Duke of Wellington, Sir Arthur Wellesley, and here Napoleon is going to suffer a massive defeat. This is the final defeat. This time, it won't be the French. It won't be, the French who have to deal with his exile. They're not going to help in facilitating it. It's going to be a more permanent exile here. If honestly, Napoleon is quite lucky he wasn't executed. It's perhaps only because of the sort of admiration that these other military powers have for him that the decision is to once again exile him, but this time to St. Helena, a small island in the South Atlantic. So here Napoleon remains in exile until his death in 1821. But his memory haunts both French political life as well as, these combined European powers for decades after his defeat. Because what's going to wind up happening is, how do we ensure that another Napoleon Bonaparte doesn't come around again? That's what we want to know. So we're going to start to see a coalition, right? We've already seen the coalition, but we're going to see, it's one thing to team up in a militaristic manner and to arm yourselves and defeat your unified common foe. But what about the aftermath? I mean, the French Empire expanded into boundaries that used to belong to other European powers. So we need to think about what this is going to look like now. So after the defeat of Napoleon, European rulers are going to have to sort of try to restore the old order as they want. This is a more conservative, less revolutionary sentiment that's being carried across these European powers. So Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, they're going to outline their goals, and they're going to meet at what's known as the Congress of Vienna in September of 1814. So this is where the final peace settlement is going to be arranged. And you can see from this depiction, the sort of cutting up the map of Europe here. So one of the attendants is a Clemens von Metternich, and von Metternich serves the King of Austria. So he is the Austrian foreign minister, and he's one of the most influential leaders at this meeting. See, he claims the principle of legitimacy guides him. And by that legitimacy, what he means is that a lawful monarch from a royal family who had ruled before Napoleon should and would be restored to their positions of power. And this should be true not just for Austria, it should be true of France as well. So the victorious powers already restored the famed Bourbon family, and so King Louis XVIII is once again restored to the French throne in 1814. And they're going to apply this standard across Europe as a means to sort of ensure peace and stability, as they call it. It is natural for these countries to have absolute monarchs and for the people of those nations to be ruled over by them. It is the best method, they would argue. Time-honored, and it works in their eyes. But of course, for them, it works because they are in positions of power, prestige, and privilege. So, now we got to talk about the practicality here, because some old as well as some new sort of philosophies are going to emerge in the aftermath of Napoleon's defeat. So we're going to address these sort of issues here as they arise during and post the Congress of Vienna. So they are going to rearrange the territories in Europe, as I said. And this is going to form a new balance of power. Basically, the new balance of power is essentially the old balance of power before the French Revolution and certainly before Napoleon's spread of the French Empire. And they do this because they want to keep any one country from dominating Europe. So they have to balance, both their political and military forces that sort of guarantee the independence of the great powers. So as an example, to balance Russian territorial gains, new territories were given to Prussia and Austria, as we can see here and here. So you can see from the borders of what once was, part of the French Empire, it's going to be given over to Prussia and Austria to enlarge in them. So now that you have these two German states on either side, it can kind of act as like a shield against, say Russia if they had ambitions to invade. And of course, Prussia and Austria, being German states, are backed by, guess what, more various German states that have not yet been nationalized and identified. But they will. They will coalesce into one massive German state eventually, with the exception of Austria. But Austria is going to be so allied to Germany in the decades to come. So the arrangements seem to work out at the Congress of Vienna. And they're playing on the political philosophy known as conservatism. And this is what Metternich, he believes, is the best system, right? So this is just a political philosophy based on tradition and social stability, favoring obedience to political authority and organized religion, right? So the old regime of religion, if you were a Catholic in your state, in your nation, and that was the majority, then that's going to be restored and respected, as an example. But most conservatives, and of course, obviously, absolute monarchs being restored. That'd be a very conservative belief as well at this time. So they believe that, absolute monarchs who are given their authority by God to rule, followed with religion, are crucial in order to keep society in check, in order. So by nature, they hate revolutions. And so they are unwilling to accept the demands from the people who want either individual rights or representative governments. So this is a big step back for, say, an emerging middle class that were big fans, supporters of the French Empire and the revolutionary ideas that came with it. So to maintain the new balance of power, Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and then eventually later France, agreed to meet in conferences to discuss their common interests and to maintain the peace in Europe. And these meetings become called the Concert of Europe. So the powers that be are going to adopt a principle of intervention, they say. The idea that the great powers have the right to send armies into countries where there are revolutions so that they can restore what they believe are legitimate governments. And of course, those are based on, their religions and of course, the absolute monarchs that rule in their respective nations. So according to this principle, they are going to send in these, armies to restore legitimate monarchs. And Britain, however, is the only one that's kind of against this. They argue that they should not interfere in the internal affairs of other states. This could get tricky. It could lead to greater, military excursions, it could lead to massive wars, is what they argue. However, the other great powers, they're going to disregard Britain's argumentation, and they're going to use military force to end revolutions in Spain and Italy to restore them to the old regime. So let's talk about these forces of change a bit further here, as we're sort of nearing the end. So between a 15-year period of 1815 and 1830, we're going to see a few new concepts. We've already seen them, but we're going to define them a bit further. Liberalism and nationalism. And we're going to sprinkle in things like republicanism as well. So these forces are at work. You're going to have opposition. The Enlightenment is still there. The works of the philosophies still exist. They've been read, they've been consumed. People are aware. And with these Enlightenment ideas comes the idea of liberalism, this sort of political philosophy that is based largely on these, Enlightenment principles, holding that people should be as free as possible from government restraints, and that civil liberties, the basic rights of all people, should be protected. So they want equality before the law, as Napoleon and his Napoleonic Code had ensured, unless, of course, you were a woman. They want freedom of assembly. They want freedom of speech. They want freedom of the press. And they believe that this all should be guaranteed in a single document, such as the American Bill of Rights or, the Doromac, right? The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, as was in France during the French Revolution. They also believe that you should have a constitution. And so this is a concept of constitutionalism that flows from liberalism. So in a constitutional monarchy, like in England, a king must follow the laws of the Constitution. They would like that. So if we're to have a king, and this is kind of like, a conciliatory idea of the Enlightenment philosopher, if you're to have a king, it should be an enlightened one, one that follows the law. It does not just make rules and laws up arbitrarily. So liberalism therefore breeds liberals who believe that written documents would help guarantee the rights of the citizens, of the people. They also want things like religious toleration for all, another Enlightenment philosophy. They want separation of church and state. They demand the right of peaceful opposition to the government, to protest peacefully, not to overthrow, necessarily speaking. They want a representative government, right? They want a legislature that's going to be, of course, elected by qualified voters to make laws for them, laws that might go into a constitution that a king would have to follow. So these ideals are all very similar to republicanism, right? The belief that a government's power comes from the rule of law and the citizens who are allowed to vote, right? So government comes from the rule of law and from the elected representatives that the people put into that position of power, and those people who are elected can certainly be recalled or they can be voted out and replaced. However, not all of the liberals believe that everyone had a right to vote. We saw this during the era of the philosophes themselves. We see it during the French Revolution phases. We certainly see it during the French Empire with Napoleon. So the more pervasive belief of who has the right to vote and should is basically the idea that to vote and to hold office, it should really only be open to men of property. So once again, the ladies are losing out on this one. So liberalism is going to be very closely tied, that is, to middle-class men who wanted voting rights for themselves so they could share power with the landowning classes. This is done because they're not just like the nobility, they're like the royal families, they're like the landowning classes and the elites of society. The liberals too fear mob rule, and they have very little desire to share their power with a class that is lower than them. And of course, as we talked about in the session prior to this, we have nationalism. It had arose and awoken during the spread of the French Empire by Napoleon and his Grand Army, and those that were conquered and defeated. Just so it didn't exist just within France. It extends well beyond its boundaries of what became the French Empire. People start to realize that they are part of a community, of a nation. They have a distinct language. They have common institutions and customs and cultures. So historically, your loyalty would be to your king and then to your town or region. But now, in the 19th century, during this era, the Napoleonic era, if you will, people believed that their chief loyalty was to their nation. And so now we start to see nationalists spring up. From the French Revolution, every nationality should have its own government becomes a common belief. So Germans, who are separated to many principalities, as we can see, they want a national unity under one central government and a German nation state. So you're going to see all of this territory, mostly all of it, become one German state. Hungary, they want to be separated from Austria. And of course, all of this is going to have a massive effect when we move forward with our history lessons, when by the time we get to World War I. So the threat here, though, that nationalism possesses is that it threatens the existing order. They could influence certain... All right, so that's our time. We basically just see that it threatens existing groups to break away from the powers that be, basically the balance of power set up by the Congress of Vienna. And this could mean breakups for certain European powers, and that means it could lead to war, as people who want to rule over themselves will be prevented from doing so. All right, that's our session, folks. I'll see you all next time. Have a great rest of your day.